If you're familiar with Numbers chapter 12, I want to take you there. It's the story of when Moses is talked bad about by his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam, and something that I'd never considered, I've never heard before, so correct me if I'm wrong in the comments or let me know your thoughts. But I've never considered the correlation between this story and the Mount of Transfiguration. So I'm just going to go down the bullet point list I made as I was reading at the coffee shop, and I'd love to know your guys' thoughts. And I'll probably sum up at the end why I believe these are connected, why it's helpful to recognize their connection. If you're unfamiliar, Miriam and Aaron, they are essentially going, who's Moses to be the only mouthpiece of God? And they speak bad about him. God summons them. I'll actually read it for you. Miriam and Aaron, because it's a short chapter. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he'd married. He had married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not also spoken through us? And the Lord heard it. And now the man Moses was very meek. Now we get a description of Moses, and more than all people who were on the face of the earth. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. And the three of them came out. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they came forward. And he said, hear my words. If there's a prophet among you, I myself make myself known to him. In a vision, I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He's faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth clearly, and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. Now when the cloud was removed from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous like snow. And Aaron turned toward Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said to Moses, oh, my Lord, don't punish us. Notice how Aaron's talking to Moses. Because we've done foolishly and have sinned. Let her not be as one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb. And then Moses cries to God. Moses is a mediator for Aaron, who brings his plea to Moses about Miriam. But the Lord said to Moses, if her father had just spit in her face, wouldn't she have been ashamed for 7 days? Let her be shut outside the camp 7 days, and after that she may be brought in again. And so Miriam was shut outside the camp 7 days, and the people didn't set out on the march till Miriam was brought in again. And after that the people set out from Hazeroth and camped in the wilderness of Paran. Now if you're familiar with the story on the right-hand side, Matthew 17, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain where he is transfigured. They behold a bit of his glory kind of manifest in the flesh. He's set apart from Moses and Elijah. Peter says, let's build tents for you guys. A cloud consumes them, and they find themselves immersed in a cloud. And God says, this is my beloved son. Listen to him. And then when the cloud lifts, they're on their face in fear. Jesus says, it's okay, boys. They look up. Moses and Elijah are gone. And then they go down the mountain after seeing a vision, Luke's gospel tells us. And they have this conversation about John and how he'll come to restore and who's Elijah. It's John the Baptist. And then they come down to a father who's desperate because his son is demonized and the disciples couldn't cast the demon out. And so Jesus says, oh, how long am I to be with this unbelieving generation? Bring him to me. And then he says, do you believe? And the father says, if you can do anything. And Jesus goes, if I can do anything. What are you talking about? And then the father goes, help my unbelief. I do believe. And then Jesus restores the boy, casts out the demon, and things are great. Now, I've noticed a few parallels that I'd like to note. Verse 1 and 2 in chapter 12 of Numbers. We're going to primarily work with Numbers and just make a few correlations to the story to the right. In both stories, you have someone being against what the prophet is doing. Now, before Peter, James, and John go up the mountain, right before this, you have Peter trying to frustrate the plan of God. Jesus says the Son of Man is about to be handed over to the leaders to be crucified, essentially. And Peter goes, no way. He's against that. I will not let you die. Well, right here we have Miriam and Aaron speaking against what Moses is doing with marrying a Cushite woman. Now, not to parallel him marrying a Cushite woman with Jesus being executed for the salvation of humanity, but to say there is a frustration with what the prophet is doing. In verse 3, we have a description of, or primarily I want to focus here, this is about the speaking. Has God only spoken through Moses? He's spoken through us too. And then we have a description of Moses, right? When we get to the Mount of Transfiguration, there's a description of Jesus. Moses is meek here. Jesus is shining in full strength. His face shone like the sun. His clothes are white as light. We have this description of the prophet of God. In both stories, you have three individuals pulled away or present. In the Mount of Transfiguration story, you have Jesus and Moses and Elijah on the mountain. In Numbers 12, you have Moses, Miriam, and Aaron, who are each playing prophetic roles. Aaron is a priest primarily, but he's also been a mouthpiece for Moses in the sense that he's a prophet for Moses, just as Moses is a prophet for God, right? So God sends Moses, Moses sends Aaron. Miriam is also referred to as a prophetess. And so you have these three prophets called to the tent, and on the mountain, you have the three prophets, Jesus being the ultimate prophet. You have the three prophets summoned on the mountain, where God is going to distinguish between them. And then you have three coming to God on the mountain. You have Peter, James, and John, which can parallel to Moses, Miriam, and Aaron being summoned to the tent. And then you have this conversation on tents. God tells them to come to the tent. He descends on the tent. They leave the tent. This is all around the tabernacle in the tent of meeting. Whereas in Matthew chapter 17, Peter says, hey, let's build a tent. One for you, Moses, one for Elijah, one for you, Jesus. And then what you have in both stories is God will come down to meet with the people. Right here, the Lord comes down in a pillar of cloud. Now in Matthew 17, guess what happens? Peter speaks, says something that God seemingly corrects, just like he comes to correct Moses or Aaron and Miriam in Numbers 12. And he descends in the same way he does in Numbers 12, in a bright cloud that actually overshadows them. Now in Luke's gospel, we're told that they're actually consumed by the cloud. They're immersed in it. So they're actually inside of this cloud that is going to make utterance about Jesus. So God comes down in both stories in a cloud to meet with the three, but also to make a correction about what someone has said about really his prophetic mouthpiece. Now, we also have in verse 5, God is distinguishing Moses from the other two, right? He says, hey, Moses or Aaron and Miriam, you two come forward. And then he's going to say, I talked to Moses differently than other prophets and prophetesses, right? So you have Aaron and Miriam as prophetic voices coming forward. Moses is being set apart from them. In Matthew 17, you have Moses and Elijah not coming forward, but fading into the background as Jesus comes forward, right? Once they lift, the disciples kind of overcome their fear and look up. Jesus comforts them. They see Moses and Elijah are gone, and Jesus is the only one left. Both of these stories is God making a declaration about his prophetic mouthpiece, about his word flowing through that person and what he's doing through that person. Now, Jesus is the ultimate greater Moses, right? So it's a bit different. But in verse 6, we have God answering man's evaluation and wrong conclusion, right? In Matthew 17, Peter's going to say, let's build here. God's going to come and correct that. No, we can't stay here. And also, it's not about staying at the law and the prophets. We got to move on to Jesus, who's the fulfillment, the embodiment of both. We got to follow him down the mountain, not stay up here, okay? In Numbers chapter 12, God is correcting what they've said about Moses. And he says, you guys think you know what you're talking about, but if there's a prophet among you, I reveal myself to him in a vision or in a dream, right? But not with my servant Moses. He's faithful in all my house. I talk to him differently, right? I have a different interaction and relationship with him than the typical prophet. So we have that correction in both stories. You also have God giving a vision. Here he gives a vision to the prophets in Numbers 12. And in Luke's gospel, we're told Jesus goes down the mountain and he tells Peter, James, and John, don't tell anyone about the vision that you just had. I think it's tell no one the vision, right here in verse 9. Right, so this conversation on visions and prophets. And in verse 7, God is legitimizing one from the other two. Moses is faithful in God's house. He's set apart differently. But in Matthew 17, Jesus is not just faithful in God's house, like Hebrews says, like he is the one who establishes the house of God as the Son of God. In fact, when God comes to correct the misunderstanding about Jesus, because that's what this has been leading up to. We've been seeing along the way up to the Mount of Transfiguration Peter has had a couple of right things about Jesus, but he's also had some wrong views of what he's come to do and who he is. And so God the Father corrects Peter and what other disciples are thinking that's incorrect. And he says, this is my son. So this is an escalation. This is not, he's faithful in my house. No, this is my son. And so this is a step above Moses, way above Moses. Now in verse 8, there's a unique revelation of God. He says, look, with Moses I speak mouth to mouth clearly, not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Right? Moses beholds God's face and God's form. There's a unique revelation. Well, on the mountain, what we have are Peter, James, and John having a unique revelation of God in the face of Jesus. They're beholding his glory in his face. And as he changes form and is transfigured, as he emanates the glory of God in his flesh, right? And they're getting a unique revelation of the Son, which is, I think, mapping onto what Moses gets. Now in verse 9, God is displeased with what is said. Earlier in this portion of Matthew, we actually have Peter coming up to Jesus saying, you'll never die. And Jesus goes, get behind me, Satan, right? And here I think the Father's kind of correcting that as well. Any misconceptions that might still be present. Well, in Numbers chapter 12, and Peter goes, let's build a tent, and God kind of corrects that. Well, God is displeased with what Aaron and Miriam have said about Moses. He's correcting that. Now, when God is done speaking in both stories, something happens. Now, right here in Numbers chapter 12, the anger of the Lord is present. That's not present in Matthew 17 explicitly. There's no anger of the Lord. But the cloud removes, and Miriam has leprosy. Well, that's not good. Well, when the cloud essentially lifts in Matthew 17, and they see Jesus after being terrified, and they're comforted by him, they look up, and guess what? They go down the mountain, or Moses and Elijah disappear. So after God is done speaking, in Matthew 17, Moses and Elijah disappear. In Numbers 12, Miriam gets leprosy. Now they're standing in the cloud with the tabernacle in Numbers chapter 12, right? They're immersed in the presence of God, descending in the cloud. And in Matthew 17, it's the same thing. But instead of God descending on the tabernacle, like in Numbers 12, Jesus is tabernacling as God in the flesh. So you have the true tabernacle with Peter, James, and John on the mountain, and the cloud descends on Jesus, who is the tabernacle, the true tabernacle tent. In verse 11, there's an infirmity and an issue. Miriam has leprosy. Well, and that's on the other side of this cloud experience with God. The cloud lifts, Miriam has leprosy. There's an infirmity or an issue on the other side of this mountaintop experience in Matthew 17. They come down the mountain after the cloud lifts and God speaks, and there's a boy who's demonized, and the father's crying out for help. And in verse 11 here, there's a desperate cry. Aaron cries out to Moses, "Oh, please, we've done foolishly, we've sinned." Well, here the father's desperate, and he cries out to Jesus, "Lord, have mercy on my sons. He suffers terribly. I brought him to your disciples. They couldn't heal him," right? So there's this inability on the part of the disciples. They can only do so much and go so far in this case. Same with Numbers 12. Aaron can only do so much. He cannot heal Miriam. Neither can Moses. Both have reached their limits. God is the one that has to do something, but he lets time kind of pass. In both stories, there's someone that considered to be dead, right? He says, let her not be as one dead. There's a comparison being made between Miriam's leprosy and someone who's dead, whose flesh is half eaten. Like, don't let her be that. Well, the demonized young boy, after Jesus casts out the demon, in Luke's gospel, it actually tells us that he was considered to be dead. And then Jesus comes over and he's okay, right? And then in Luke, or rather here, there's a cry for God's healing from Moses. Moses cries to the Lord, "Oh God, please heal her." And then Jesus here, so Moses can't provide the healing, but in Matthew 17, Jesus is the answer to the healing. So in both stories, I think they parallel, because we're to see Moses has limits, the law has limits, every prophet has their restrictions, but Jesus lifts all those in himself, being God in the flesh. He can bring us further than anyone else could. In both stories, someone's dealing with uncleanness. So Miriam has her leprosy, and here the boy has an unclean spirit. There's a natural healing period, right? Time is required for Miriam to be restored. That's why the Lord said, shut her outside 7 days and then bring her back in, right? But with this boy, there's no time required. Jesus just heals him instantly. So again, we're to see Jesus as being superior to Moses. And then we have the rebuke. God rebukes Aaron and Miriam, and Jesus rebukes the demon here in verse 18, as well as Peter right before this, correcting his misconceptions. And so beyond that, I don't know if there's anything else, but I think what we're seeing is just, once again, another statement in Matthew's gospel, bringing Jesus back to Moses, back to the story within the law to say he is superior, he's the better Moses, he's the ultimate prophet spoken of, and I think that's pretty cool. All right, let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. I'd love to know what you guys are thinking. Am I off? Am I missing something? And yeah, thanks for watching.